أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الأطهار، ولعنة دائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters, thank you so much for being here together this evening to remember the master of martyrs, Imam al-Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam. The event was planned for what was turned out to be the evening before Yom Ashura, in order to make it possible for more people to attend, and inshallah, I know some others are on the way. But to some extent, we could have done this any evening or any day. The important thing is the reason that brought us all together in this moment right now. It's very difficult every year for me to think about lecture subjects for Ashura and Arba'iniyah, not because there's some shortage of ideas or possibilities, but if I may be very honest with you for a moment, because anything I can think of seems very small compared to the events that we're commemorating. There are so many scholars, and Lord knows, so many much more equipped, educated, of higher standing, who are able to conduct these lectures in a way or at a level that I think, okay, this is good. This is the bare minimum. And I will tell you, I wonder every year, can I do this again? Because the event is so profound that who am I? And yet, Ahmed manages to convince me to do it. Now, really, the reason that I do it is because I think about, well, I was blessed to study in Hausa in Karbala, and I mean blessed as opposed to Najaf or Qom, and mashallah, absolutely nothing is wrong with those houses. They're wonderful. But to be in the shadow of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Abu Fadl al-Abbas, every day, if I close my eyes, it's still very easy for me to picture early in the morning taking the bus from the second with the other talaba into Markaziyya and then into the main shrine areas, and the view of the domes on Imam Hussein's shrine, with the bright sunlight gleaming off of them and pigeons everywhere. And that motivates me so that I'm able to welcome. That motivates me so that I'm able to at least try and talk about this. So inshallah, the point of that, I suppose, is a long way to say, forgive me for my nerves or any stumbles this evening in attempting to do any of this subject justice, particularly in just one lecture. There's a reason that these are usually divided up over 10 nights. صل على محمد وآل محمد. صل على محمد وآل محمد. Before one of my acquaintances showed up, I was trying to figure out if I should bother going into the subject of who is Imam Hussein alayhi salam, because probably for a lot of people here, this is requires no explanation, or no explanation would be sufficient. So for the benefit of our guests, I would like to take an opportunity to clarify for that. Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam, peace be upon him, was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. He had many grandchildren. However, before the Prophet was martyred, he assigned successorship, or rather, God assigned successorship to his son-in-law, Ali, son of Abi Talib. Hussein and his brother Hassan were both born to the Prophet's daughter Fatima, and Ali assigned successorship, and here I mean successorship of the religion's future and its administration, to his son Hassan. We call this imamate. And before Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was martyred, he explicitly designated his brother Hussein as his successor. And from there are 9 other imams in chain of succession that all come from the offspring of Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam. So this is just a very brief sketch so that people have a reference point for who we're talking about. Because I can tell you, when I first came to the religion, it was through Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and at the beginning it was very confusing for me. The names are hard to keep track of. Many are familiar or seem similar to each other, and yeah, it can be a little intimidating. So for the very basics, for those of you where this is all as foreign as it once was to me, Imam Hussein, Prophet's grandson. I was trying to think of what are some of the best examples to illustrate Imam Hussein's character, starting early in his life and throughout. And one of the One of the prime examples that I thought of that when I became a father was the most poignant, the most significant to me, were the many reports of a very young Hussein climbing on the back of his grandfather, the Prophet, when the Prophet was leading the prayers. And the narrations we have talk about how when the Prophet would go into sujood, Imam Hussein would climb up onto his back, and the Prophet would sometimes either try to extend his sujood, what have you, but eventually would just put his arm around his back. So when he came up into the seating position, Hussein didn't fall and hurt himself, and then he would return again into the prostrating position. I thought that story has always struck me as remarkable, not just because of the intense love that it showed of the Prophet for his grandson, but the intense or clear humanity of the people we're talking about. Yes, these are divinely selected beings, and anyone who knows me, I think, knows I'm never been accused of being a muqassir, but the love displayed there is profoundly touching to me, and I think about it a lot whenever my daughter tries to jump on me when I'm in salah. As he grew a little bit older, he and his brother Hassan once famously saw an elder in the community who had some defect in his wudu, in his ritual ablutions. Now, the reason, especially for our guests, that this is a problem or an important thing is that if there is a major defect in ablution, then deeds performed with that ablution may have validity problems. It's very easy in the community to scold people over things, like little things. Sometimes, there's a grain of truth in the reason for the scolding, but Imam Hussein and his brother had a very clever way of providing guidance to people without necessarily making it totally obvious that that's what they were trying to do. And they did this in order to preserve the dignity of the people they were guiding, especially in this case when it was someone who was one of their elders. So what they did in this circumstance was after they saw the problem in the person's ablutions, they agreed that they would, fake is not the right word, but put on a little bit of a display by pretending to have an argument about which one of them had the more correct method of ablution between the two brothers. And that they would ask this particular man to judge which one of them was performing it more correctly. And in the process of doing that, the elderly gentleman recognized what was happening and what his error had been, and was very appreciative and said as much to them, that they approached him in a way that was both kind but corrective and respectful of his dignity. And you have to think, this is a very, I don't want this to sound like the problem with youth today kind of comment. It's not actually, I think, a problem, but it's very impressive to see anyone that young so keenly aware of not just manners, but being able to empathize deeply and understand where other people in very different positions of life or age were coming from. صلوا على محمد وآل
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Imam Hussein alayhi salam came from not just the most remarkable household, but an incredibly loving household. I already mentioned the example of him climbing on his grandfather. But unfortunately, it was also from a household that from the beginning and spanning generations was subject to more oppression, abuse, betrayal, and abandonment than certainly any other that I've been close to familiar with in history. Naturally, there's disputes about any dates or ages or things in Islamic history. Part of that's, because of Hijri and Miladi conversion. Some of it's because of varying reports. But you do the math, assuming Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was born around the third year after Hijra, would make him about 8 years old at the point that his grandfather, the Prophet of Islam, was martyred. That began an endless series of trials and tribulations for this holy household. Within the span of a year, the 8-year-old Hussein had to withstand not just the loss of his grandfather, who was practically a second father, to the extent that the Imam is always referred to as the Prophet's son, but he had to withstand the very violent injury and intrusion on their home, in which his mother, Lady Fatima alayhi salam, was so severely injured that she lost one of his unborn brothers and ultimately was martyred as a result of her wounds and sorrow. He had to witness the attempted, and I say attempted intentionally, the humiliation of his father and the Prophet's well-established successor, to the extent that Imam Ali alayhi salam would lead Fatima al-Zahra along with Hassan and Hussein alayhim salam around on a donkey, going from house to house seeking supporters, sufficient supporters that he could reclaim his right, and yet never found those, because the community was so fast to abandon that family after the Prophet was gone. Truly shocking. And if I try to imagine what any 8-year-old would think witnessing all of this, I don't know that most would be able to withstand all of it. Subsequently, by the time he was 37, Hassan, his beloved brother, was martyred. And finally, by the time he was 57, or between 55 and 57, he faced his final betrayal by the people of Kufa. And Hussein himself, along with 72 or so of his companions, were martyred in the most savage ways in what was, by what was fundamentally an army that prefigured the modern organization of ISIS. So here's what's most remarkable about all of that to me, or at least what I'm going to highlight tonight, is that at every step of the way there were choices. Choices that people in the Muslim Ummah made or didn't, and choices that the members of Ahlul Bayt made or didn't. And they're worth considering, because looking back in history, it's very easy to think everything happened the way it did because it couldn't have happened differently. And yet things could have gone differently in quite a few ways. When Imam Hussein, or rather when Fatima Zahra alayhi salam was informed that she was going to have or give birth to Imam Hussein, it was actually Jibreel came to the Prophet and said, God wants me to give you glad tidings of a grandson that you're going to have, and he will be martyred by your nation after you. Got to be a shocking thing to hear. And the Prophet said, I have no need of a grandson who's going to be murdered once I'm gone. What do you mean? And Jibreel left and then returned and repeated the same thing. God sends his salutations to you and blessings on that you're going to have a grandson who will be oppressed and murdered by the people after you are gone. And again, he says, I don't need that. Jibreel comes a third time and says the same thing, but with an important addition. He explains that in addition to this, Hussein would be the possessor of well, in English, I guess, the imamate, the leadership after Ali and Hassan, and that the lineage of imams after him would come through him. That he would be an imam, a wasi. And the Prophet said, okay, I accept. And then he went to his daughter Fatima and said, God gives you greetings. You're going to have this son. He'll be murdered by the nation after me. And again, she says, I have no need of a son who is going to be murdered. Not because this is like, the kid would be too weak or something like that and got killed. Because who would want that? As holy as these personalities were, again, we have to remember they have these fundamentally human elements. They may be able to withstand incredible emotional pain in a way that few humans could, but it doesn't mean that that pain isn't there, or that the love they feel is any less significant than the love anyone else here would feel for their children. So the Prophet came again and said the same, but with the addition of noting he would be ultimately the successor in imamate in protecting the divine religion. And Fatima Zahra alayhi salam said, okay, I am satisfied with this. And it is said in the same report in Al-Kafi that the pregnancy and delivery were extremely painful and difficult for her after that. So there were choices. There were choices clearly implied here that both the Prophet and his daughter had concerning even the Imam's conception or birth. Likewise, the Imam had choices about the amount of restraint and forbearance that he showed before the events of Karbala, as in from the martyrdom of the Prophet and the oppression on the household, and that oppression renewed again after Imam Ali alayhi salam's martyrdom. The Imam had choices about whether or how he would handle that situation, whether he would rise up or not. And Lord knows there would have been quite a bit of pressure on him to do so, just like there was with subsequent Imams, in fact. If anything, some of the splits and deviations that happened subsequently in the religion of Tashayyu, we can see traced directly to this idea that Imams have to rise up against the government and challenge them. They have to launch some kind of revolution. And while Imam Hussein ultimately did that, in a sense, it was certainly not with, as we'd say in English, reckless abandon. He didn't run into that ignorantly or something. Perhaps most significantly, we learn in our books that Imam Hussein alayhi salam also had a choice about martyrdom at all. In Kitab al-Qafi, volume 1, there's a report from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. He says that when God sent down, and in some narrations it's angels or others, as divine support to the extent there was so much that it filled the space between the heavens and the earth, that the Imam was given a choice of support or victory, depending on how you want to parse the word, and meeting God. So he chose to meet God, the exalted. I had to think for a very long time about that report. I'm sure most of you here, if you've heard it before, have thought a lot about it. And if you're hearing it now for the first time, probably, inshallah, spend quite a bit of time after this event reflecting on it. The point is, Imam Hussein had an out at every step of the way. In fact, before he was even born, his mother and grandfather had sort of outs, exits, off-ramps that they could have taken that would, in all likelihood, have prevented this from happening. However, one of the lessons that I think is maybe the most important in all of this, along with the forbearance, the sabr, the patience that they showed, was when something bad is unfavorable to you, let me put it that way, is going to happen from a choice that you made. However, the choice was the right one. As in, you have a tough decision to make. There's what's the right choice and what is maybe the easier choice. You know what the outcome will be for each, but especially if you make what is the right choice, but more difficult. You may know that there will be multiple steps involved in this process, that each one of those stages or steps will have serious ramifications, that they will be painful in some way, physically or emotionally, that they will involve loss. And you may also know that, for you at least, it doesn't feel like a choice. Does that make sense? It's a choice. But in your heart, you know there's only one answer to that. And I think this is something exhibited by the members of Ahl Bayt from Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam's birth until his martyrdom. There were choices, but at every step, the Imam took the only path that he would take. The only one that would be consistent with his character, with the character of those who raised him. And with the character he knew his Lord wished to see him exhibit. The last subject I'd wish to touch upon, inshallah, is how do we apply this in our daily lives. For the purposes of this discussion, I've divided it up into sort of 3 levels of decisions. I admit that's artificial to some extent. But the reality is, one of the things that makes it it's easy sometimes to leave the lessons of Karbala shortly after Al-Bainiyah, and you move on to other events and things. But one of the things that makes it kind of harder for those lessons to stick, I think, is it's such an epic event. I don't mean epic in like a positive sense, but it's such a massive, earth-shaking, kind of historic, defining event. What is the lesson for someone like me who gets up in the morning and goes to work, and comes home and sees his family, and has to pay taxes, whatever else, make sure his car is filled up? I would suggest that there are maybe 3 levels or so of choices or examples that we might be able to draw from this. One of the main things the Imam stresses in his uprising, and I also want to clarify, the reason I'm not going into that a lot in detail here is because I know that we'll have the story of that recited shortly. But one of the main reasons is fundamentally enjoining good and forbidding wrong. I mean, he says this repeatedly, that he says, I didn't come out to sort of aggrandize myself or make a name or seek worldly rewards or other things like this, but from a religious obligation to command what is correct and forbid what is wrong. There are conditions for this, depending on which scholars you read anyway. For instance, the person that you're trying to say, hey, maybe that's not a good idea, and they're going to Las Vegas for a business meeting or something, I don't know. They have to be, one condition that's commonly cited is they have to be open to being persuaded that that's the wrong idea. If the person is fully committed to doing something that they already know to be wrong, that obligation is not triggered in the same way for you. But I think, well, the easiest way is to look at some examples. At home, with our children, with our spouses, with our parents, do we handle them, whether it's enjoining right or forbidding wrong or anything else, or just giving guidance or correction in a way that's consistent with what Imam Hussein alayhi salam demonstrated throughout his life? For instance, the story of Imam Hussein and Imam Hassan alayhi salam correcting the older gentleman with his wudu. Do we conduct ourselves in this way? Or do we conduct ourselves, inshallah we don't, in a way that is tyrannical, that is consistent with the characteristics of Yazid or his father Muawiyah? La'anahumullah. In our daily work, we encounter situations, whether it's physical contact with non-mahram, or whether it is there's a business outing and it's going to look weird if I don't go to this, and it's at like a brewery. MashaAllah, they have a regular menu you can order off of. Nothing's the law on it, but you can eat the vegetarian option. But again, there's a brewery. Their main thing is serving beer, this kind of thing. And it would be so easy to just let it slide. And again, I think the Imam had a lot of outs. I'm not trying to compare the events of Ashura to one of our daily moral problems, but what I mean is he knew what was going to happen with the Kufans. No offense if anyone here is from that area, but at the time, different crowd. People who swore up and down that they would support him sent him these letters, which what is he going to do? Say, no, I'm not going to go. If one person there sent him a letter saying, please come help us, the Imam is going to go, even if he knows what's waiting. So he could have let it slide, but he didn't. I'm not also saying that you need to obsess about every little thing. This is also a problem that, mashallah, I've witnessed many times among the believers. And again, I don't mean this in an insulting way, but in a constructive criticism kind of way. It's very easy sometimes to, instead of, the problem is not letting things slide, it's taking everything a little too far. But there are also some bigger choices. Questions, for instance, about who will approve or accept as a spouse for one of our children. And what criteria will we use? Will we use divine criteria for those, as in Iman? Or will we use things like income, social status, profession of the suitor, things like this? Even though these are fundamentally concepts alien to the religion of Islam. Imam Hussein, alayhi salam, we may say, could say, was martyred for many different reasons. One of those reasons was not, so you could say, yeah, I could be a good husband for my daughter, but not an engineer. No. And then there are the biggest choices. The choices that, even if they require very little of us, whether we do anything or don't do anything, have some sort of special moral gravity, let's say. And here, the answers get a lot less clear sometimes. It is easy for me to be here in this room on this minbar wearing this jafia because I was born here, my parents were born here, and if I say something about genocide, I'm not going to wind up, probably, in an ICE detention center somewhere. I don't have families, members whose immigration status might be up in the air. And here I want to say, I don't know what the right answers are, because there are competing legal principles. I mean, by all means, ask your Munajat, but it's a lot to think about. If you have the opportunity, you're put in a position where you can raise your voice, even if that won't change anything, about some moral abomination that is happening. And on the one hand, there's the overriding commandment that we preserve ourselves, preserve life. And on the other hand, there is the example of the Imam. So here, I don't know the answer. But I would like to close with one other narration, which is that, well, we can say part of the reason that the Imam rose up was in defense of justice, or even the desire to establish justice. There's a short but very profound riwayah from Muhammad وآل محمد. There's a specific narration from one of the Imams, inshallah. It is Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam. Probably would have been a safe guess, but I always like to know if I can. He said that when Hussein alayhi salam was martyred, that a great clamor, the best word I could think of to use here, arose from the angels who wept before God. And they said, how could this happen to Hussein? He's your chosen. He's the son, the grandson of your prophet. And it's hard to object. I can see, again, not to question God's justice or will or other things, but that is such a shattering event to witness. And the angels, by the way, totally aware, much more than we are, of the Imam's actual station. And Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam says, instead of just some words, that God made the shadow of Al-Qa'im to appear to the angels, and said, بِهَذَا أَنْتَقِمُ لِهَذَا, that by this one I will avenge that one. The reason I mentioned it is because fundamentally, the justice that we are waiting for to be established is yet to come. But the one who will bring it is known to us. And that will be a fundamentally different event. For those of you who are interested in reading more, I would direct your attention to books like Kamal ad-Din wa Tamam al-Ya'ma, or the name will come to me after. Inshallah, you can ask. But books that deal specifically with reports around the Raja. This is very important in its connection to the events in Karbala. My last note, I promise. This event that we're doing, I don't know how many of you know this. It may be most of you, but for anyone who is curious, the morning ceremonies, the ma'atam, that are such a part of the DNA of Tashayyuh. In one report that I was looking at again today in Sheikh al-Qulayni's tremendous work, Al-Kafi, talks about Al-Kalbiya, in this case, Rabab, one of Imam Hussein's wives, who was the mother of Suqayna and of Abdullah, began organizing events, mourning and weeping, particularly, exclusively, I would assume, among the women of the household, their servants, other things like this, that they would gather and weep until their tears were exhausted. And there was even, and this is still heartbreaking to me, advice from one of the Imam's widows who said that when your tears run dry, this is the reason that she makes this barley soup and other food and keeps them around in order to, because they wish to strengthen their weeping over the Imam. So these kinds of blessed occasions, as much as they're built around lamentation, no matter what any fool says to you, remember, none of these are some kind of modern bid'ah or other things like this. These are critical manifestations, signs of the true faith. With that, I'll conclude my remarks for the evening and ask also that people give another 3 loud salawats, in particular for the reappearance of our awaited Imam al-Hujjah, Sahib al-Asri wal-Zaman. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.